I invite the panel members to
Buenas tardes.
good afternoon.
Prazer em estar acá.
So it's a pleasure being here in Costa Rica.
Combinei com meus panelistas
I-
que eu tentarei
I-
falar em
Agreed with the panel members that I'll try to speak.
temos tradução
We
simultânea
have simultaneous interpretation.
e temos panelista só que habla
We have
inglês. Só temos tradução para as três línguas
we have an interpretation for three languages: English, Portuguese,
e
and
espanhol.
Spanish.
Comigo nesse
And
painel,
we have in this panel
Trotman,
Lee Trotman.
que é auditor
He's
general
a general
do Departamento
auditor of the
Auditoria
Department
Barbados.
of Audit of Barbados. Leonardo Fraga.
Firma de auditoria
He is a partner of Grant Thornton auditing firm Argentina, and Cornelio Porras. He's the president of Inter-American Accounting Association, IEC. IEC.
Muitas graças por compor esse painel comigo. Foi prazer
It's a pleasure
ter esses painelistas comigo porque
having these panel members
esse painel
because with this panel was formed
agradecer a todos
very recently, and I want to thank everyone for delivering all the material as agreed in a timely fashion.
o objetivo do
And the objective for this panel
a relação
is a relationship between corporate governance
e o relatório
and the auditor's report
uma visão tanto do setor
of the
do setor
public sector as well as the private sector.
cada painelista
So each panel member will have 15 minutes to comment their views in the various aspects.
Mr. Trotman vai
Mr. Trotman will speak about
visão do setor
informing the public sector in governance. Leonardo Fraga,
abrará
he will speak about
o formato do relatório
the form of the auditor's report,
e Cornélio Porras
and Cornelio Porras will give his views on a corporate environment and the relationship with the independent auditors.
painel procura
This panel will focus on aspects of all aspects of the corporate world post economic crisis, all the internal developments of the corporate governance, new relationships of the auditor with the audit committee, the creation in some countries of audit committees, the evolution of the regulators in supervision of the auditors and preparers, and the role of the investors and acting actively as participants of the capitals market and the financial reporting system. So the whole system of financial reporters and accountability.
informes financeiros adequados,
Proper financial reports
a qualidade e a confiança
improve the quality of the investor and the whole market.
corporativos que são
Corporate reports that are
a real situação da
that report the real situation of the company,
não somente
which provide not only financial data, but non-financial regarding
o controle interno
also the internal control of companies for risk management, also compliance with the laws, regulations, ethics of the auditors, as well as the preparers and of the members of the audit committee.
independência de alta qualidade
Independence of high quality and consistently applied throughout the world, communication and auditors' reports. The process of inspection of entities and all the market participants, not only auditors, because there's a change. An environment is not only achieved with auditors, but with all the market players. An efficient regulator and independent with a qualified officers with the proper ingredients will be approached by the panel members, the evolution of technology and the impact of the audit and financial reports, and sustainable growth of the public interest entities, which can also positively affect non-public entities with a very positive impact. Having said this, and with all this panel and our objective, now I give the floor to Mr. Trump.
Thank you. And I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to this Crescent meeting to make this presentation. I would first want to just mention a few things about Barbados. Barbados is a very small country. We have less than 300,000 people, English-speaking country, known for political stability, tourism and financial services are our main economic activity. Now, I would just mention something here. In 2018, we had elections in Barbados. And why do I mention this in terms of this topic? It's because of the ambitious plans that the government has for improvement in the corporate governance area. But let me just give a little background in terms of where we were or where we are at this particular point in time when it comes to corporate governance in Barbados. Our country, we have very low growth. As a matter of fact, we are currently right now in a recession. We would have low investor confidence because there's not been a lot of investment in Barbados in recent times. We have allegations of corruption, high debt. We had a poor governance framework, especially the legal aspects. Government had a lot of unrecorded liabilities. We had poor ratings from the international agencies. We were blacklisted by OECD. Our reserves were being depleted quickly. The audit reports are generally not of a very good nature. Weak governance. And we also had a problem with our public infrastructure. We had a crisis in terms of our sewage system. So in summary, we would have been faced with all these issues. And I find that one of the issues that the government took frontal as they assumed office was the whole issue of corporate governance. As mentioned by the Minister of Finance from Costa Rica, it's good to have a good regulatory system, good legal framework, although a legal framework is not necessarily the end of everything. The government has taken on the legal framework frontal, first thing. And so we've passed a new Financial Management Audit Act. The other issue will be the integrity legislation, establishment of an integrity commission, a new Procurement Act, and a Freedom of Information Act as well. So in terms of the legislative framework, that is being worked on. We've already, as I said, passed the new Finance Management Act. And there are certain issues in the Finance Management Act that I think that are very useful, very interesting. We recognize that we have, as I said, allegations of corruption and so on. So, and that part of the weakness in the system had to do with the boards at the board level. So one of the new inclusion in the act is that the board members would be trained in corporate governance. Now, just as a little backdrop in Barbados, we have ministries and departments, and we have state-owned enterprises. The state-owned enterprises operate pretty much similar to private sector organization, where you have a board of directors and audit committees and so on. The ministries and departments, on the other hand, do not have such a structure. So the idea was to bring some sort of structure to ministries and departments. And what they've done is that they've created internal audits in the ministries and departments and set up an audit committee to deal with central government agencies. In addition to as I said, the training of directors, the whole issue of reporting has also been addressed. Now, currently in Barbados, we have a lot of agencies that are years behind in their audit reporting. My last audit report, I mentioned that I think there was about 49 agencies that were 3 years in arrears, and we had about 34 that were 5 years in arrears. So we have the whole issue of disclosure is a serious matter. And some of these state enterprises have very large liabilities. So government had a situation where, virtually owed about, for a small country, $2 billion is a lot of money on recorded liabilities because our statements are not consolidated. And that is one of the main challenges that the new government face, how to deal with these state enterprises. So the new act, as I said, audit committees, they clarify the roles of the key players in government, ministers, boards, directors, internal audit established, the new audit committee, an expanded role for the director of finance because the audit committee would report to the director of finance. In terms of the auditor's role, I just want to touch on this one here a little bit. The auditor's role has actually been a kind of evolutionary one in terms of the public sector. Previously, the auditor used to report on breaches of financial rules and regulations. The whole issue of the whole matter of audit opinion wasn't really all that relevant, really, honestly. Traditionally, the auditor would, his role, according to the Act, is to report on any breaches of financial rules and irregularities. But the new Act, well, not the new Act, in 2009, I think, we changed that to include the audit opinion. But one of the expanded role of the audit office now in the new Act has to do with non-financial reporting. So in essence, let me put it in perspective. The public auditor reports on compliance with rules and regulation. That's one report. He gives an audit opinion, which is what we're talking about here, the auditor's report. And now there's a third requirement for the auditor, which we haven't really gone into in great detail because the Act has just been passed, where the auditor would report on non-performance issues. So each ministry or department or agency would have to determine their output and have some way in which the auditor would have an examination to see if they actually came up with the outputs. And then there are also sanctions as well in this new Act. The reports, everything will be transparency. It will be placed on the website. And the Auditor General's reports will be debated in Parliament. I should also mention that we are on the IMF program as it is now. So targets have been set for all outstanding audit reports, and they are supposed to be completed sometime in June. We'll see how that one goes. My department, we audit some state-owned enterprises, not all. The private sector audit would audit the majority. As I mentioned earlier, we had also the OECD blacklisting. Primarily, this was a very interesting matter because Barbados didn't feel that they deserve such a blacklisting. They see that one of their competitive advantages is a low tax regime. But the issue was that we had a low tax regime for external investors or external agencies while we had a high tax regime for the locals. So what Barbados would have done is they've decided that they will have a convergence of these tax regimes. So now we have a lower level, the lower level, which is like 2%, 2 to 5%. So normally a firm in Barbados would be paying like 30% tax, and now they're down to the 2.5 to 5%. And I think last week, Friday, we were actually taken off that blacklisting. Now we understand, and I mean the whole morning we were discussing the whole issue of corporate governance and the importance of good corporate governance. And I think in Barbados that's recognized as well. So there has been renewed activity in this particular area. And as I said, the legislation, but we need to move now from the legislation now actually to the implementation. And I think that that's where some of the challenges will come by. It's good to have good legislation, but then we have to have the structures and the regulation to support that regulation. And that is being worked on at this particular point in time. I think one of the challenges that we face, though, is the fact that corporate governance failure in Barbados sometimes occur at the board level, quite frankly. So the board is supposed to make sure that there's a good structure in place, and unfortunately, sometimes the weakness or the failure is at the board level. And it's mainly along the lines of procurement, the absence of transparency in the whole procurement process. That is one of the repeating challenges that comes up year after year. And I think that to some extent the new legislation will assist in that particular area. Because as I said, there are new areas, the full disclosure, more transparency, better accountability because you can be sanctioned, the absence of conflict of interest, the declaration of assets and so on. So these measures will actually help. In terms of the auditor and the audit committee, as I said before, this would have to be, we never had an audit committee for the ministries and departments before. So we will have to now work out that relationship between my office and the audit committee. In terms of the other state-owned enterprises, there are audit committees on some of these enterprises, but the committees are not on all, just the major ones. And there has not been a lot of communication necessarily between the auditor and the audit committee. In Barbados, again, the whole issue of the media is important. You know, we were talking in the last session about the understanding of the public of the auditor's report. And, you know, in the session before, and there was the debate that not all citizens are accountants and that type of thing. And we recognize that, honestly. And to be honest, our reports are really tailor-made in many cases, not necessarily the opinion report, but the other reports for the public, actually. Because we see the audit office as providing information to the public for greater transparency. We see that as part of our role. And, you know, one could ask, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here? Right. First of all, as I said, in the legal framework, you have to produce financial statements on a timely basis. And I think that it probably will work at least for the next 4 years because, as I said, we are on the IMF program, and government is definitely ensuring that all the commitments that they made are kept. So to some extent, we have an external agency which is kind of holding government to the fire, so to speak, for the time being. And I think that more than likely they will meet that those deadlines. The other issue that we have to look at has to do with the appointment of board members. Now, in the past, many board members have been appointed based on, well, obviously political allegiance and the like. Their interests may not necessarily be in terms of good corporate governance. And I think that that is an area that has to be looked at. I mean, you can have whatever law that you want to, but you still have to have people of integrity. So on the second front now, you have to look at the terms of appointment of board members and appoint members of integrity. The strengthening of the audit office is also another area of concern. Because if you want good audit reports, then it requires audit staff that are trained and suitably paid as well. Application of sanctions and rewards. Our system is based on the British model, and the main area of reporting in the past, as I said, has been compliance with rules and regulation. And that can have a kind of ripple effect on the society. Everybody wants to do what is right, and nobody wants to break the rules, but sometimes you have to not necessarily break the rules, but you still have to reward innovation, and sometimes keeping to rules alone in a strict way creates a challenge because it can stifle that innovation. So we still need to bring out that aspect. Transparency in procurement, that is an area, as they said, that needs to be addressed as well. I know in some countries, all the bids are on the websites and so on, and you can have a look at it. And I think that they are heading in that direction as well. More disclosure, better disclosure. One of the other challenges that we face has to do with the cash to accrual in terms of the accounting. Barbados took the plunge and decided that they would change the accounting system from the cash to accrual in a very short order, and it wasn't properly managed. And that we are still experiencing the legacy of that right now. I think that the areas that I mentioned, if there were improvements, legal improvements, regulatory framework, which we are working on, the appointment of qualified members of the boards obviously will lead to better effectiveness of the corporate governance. The monitoring, whole accountability, disclosure. My office, as they said, play a role in terms of making our reports available to the members of the public. And as I said, our reports are not just financial reports, but they're reports that can be understood by the average person. This should result in improved trust. And the other area that we are hoping that can have some, which is a key area, is to creating the climate for good business opportunity. So in conclusion, I think that there is a good relationship, important and a necessary relationship between corporate governance and the auditor. And I stretch auditor's report to include not just the audit opinion, but the range of reports that are required by legislation. Performance reports, compliance reports, and obviously the report on the financial statement. Report on the financial statements, as I indicated, is kind of limited, and the average person doesn't understand it. Technical people, accountants understand it, but we still, as auditors, want to be able to connect with the citizens, because ultimately it's the citizens that help to make the whole system better and ensure that those who are in charge govern better. And I thank you.
Graças.
Agora, Leonardo vai nos dar
Will give his presentation. Good afternoon to all, and thank you for participating in this panel and for believing that this topic for discussion is of your interest. And I also want to thank the organization of this event for understanding that it could be an interesting contribution for us to speak from the external auditor's perspective. We are hearing Edesio at the beginning of the panel, and he shared the topic to be covered by this panel, and corporate governance and the audit report and how these interrelate. In a moment in which, after years, there's an important change in the structure of the auditor's report. We come from decades of working with the compliance based model, complying the entity with accounting standards. So from our perspective as auditors, we can say if that's reasonable or not. And all of a sudden, we find the need to be, as we heard recently, to be more transparent, to be more open, and more specific, which for auditors, it's a learning process, which we believe will take additional years. Although the standard proposes a new internal audit approach, it had a few years of implementation in some countries, but the reality is that many of our countries still are in stage of implementation and not fully implemented. And we'll be speaking about what happens in Argentina in this regard. So what we're trying to do is rescue, in these few minutes, what's the link between how the communication should be between the external audit and the audit committee, which will be the corporate governance figure that auditors work with the most, knowing that the information flow and the exchange of information between audit committees and auditors will bring, as a consequence, a better product, a better audit development, and therefore a better audits report. We also speak about the challenges posed by an external audit report, which basically where the auditors have to use the same approach in risk of material correction, but not only for this information to be part of our working papers, but also present these to the business community. And of course, focusing on estimates and where professional judgment and the company's head, its opinion has relevance for this to go through the auditor's filter. What the standard changes is basically the structure of the report. We go from, as we said in the past, from saying from complying or not, to a structure that starts with defining the opinion of the auditor, if it's reasonable or not, what the accounting is presenting, to then see in more detail which are the responsibilities of the entity, audited entity, and the auditor who is performing that role with great detail in trying to clearly define what's the limit between company and auditor. And then the core of the new report, which is known as the key attention matters of the audit, where the auditor must somehow disclose which were the main concerns during their work, identify these precisely, develop, and of course explain to the business community which were the safeguards taken and which were the audit procedures used and what was the outcome of that work. At some point it implies opening files on those more essential topics we've been working on during the audit process. Then there's a specific chapter of ongoing business or continuous business where we must give our opinion what is proper, what of the criteria used by the company, understanding that we will find companies that have applied accounting criteria for operations, ongoing operations that have no risk of losing continuity. And finally, the auditor's report, this new structure also establishes being very specific regarding the information that is not an object of the audit, however, are included in the information package that the listed companies must publish. In this context, what we were saying, and with all the challenges that this entails, and we want to dedicate a few minutes to imagine how that discussion can improve between the audit committees and auditors. And let's imagine a number of questions of how the business community can react before this new challenge auditors have and the companies that are being audited. I wonder if when the auditor explains the key matters, they're assuming the role of the CFO or the company's management. Well, it's a question we can make ourselves, and we'll learn as we apply this. But as we said previously, we spoke about the need to clearly define responsibilities, and it continues being a responsibility of the CFO and the company management to disclose all those situations the company is enduring regarding its accounting. So when the auditor in the report discloses the estimates where it gave the greatest focus or the greatest amount of resources, it's not assuming that role as a CFO, but it's explaining how it approached these topics during the audit process. We can also ask ourselves is if the communication of key matters require an assessment of the CFO or the company. Of course not. It's only a way to comply with this new report structure and to explain from our audit view how we approach these concerns. We can also ask ourselves if the auditor will define the amount of key matters to be disclosed as a consequence of our understanding of the companies, and if definitely not, there's experience of some countries who have implemented this, like the case of the United Kingdom, Australia, South Africa, Holland, show that after the audit periods go by, the amount of key matters do not vary significantly, nor reduced, nor expanded, just by implementing this dynamic. These are reduced as if there are key matters that required disclosure. Therefore, this extended report and this new working approach for audit firms poses a problem for those countries that are applying this and those who are to start applying these. We have asked ourselves, how does this influence the budgets that we have for audits, and from our own standpoint are quite depleted. And it's clear that this new working approach and this new structure will imply more hours in trying to discuss this with the management and with CFOs and the companies and the directors. So there, without a doubt, we'll have a need for the companies to understand that for them to see that the product is not very different from the one they had before, because there will be an opinion. However, there'll be much more hours invested in trying to agree on things and in implementing this discussion we are proposing. And this requires more hours, management, partners, for a finished product that has to be at the level of the circumstance. And this is what the lesson from countries who have been applying this, and we learned from the past panel, the Central American experience. And we heard this from the regulator also. What happens in Argentina? Well, this audit standard still has not been adopted adopted. However, the implementation will be for 2020. Therefore, we're still in a learning stage. All the audit firms and creating awareness in the business sector, the companies will have to obviously seek, will have to improve discussions and make their positions more flexible. Not that the auditors have become more clever or skeptical, just that what we would see in the past, which was part of our roles, will now have to disclose in a report that will not only go to the board, but all the controlling agencies and of these companies that are subject to this audit. So that's pretty much a summary of my presentation. Disculpen, el microphone is off. Sorry, the microphone is off.
Em adopção e hemos notado aumento de comunicação.
We've seen an increase of communication between the auditor and the governance, valuing even more the auditor's work. So it's been a very positive experience. Now Cornelio can give his views on corporate governance in the private sector. Good afternoon. I considered it important to share some aspects related to the role of the committee and the board of directors in this approach in general terms. So you can say, or what can we expect from a board of directors? Well, we know that in general terms, a board of directors should be concerned in establishing the strategy and policies for the entity. An entity that is in certain operations. Also implement the proper control system and information flow regarding the whole company, and also supervise the upper management in complying with all those policies and procedures designed for the proper management of the company. A fourth element, an important element, is to establish the remuneration of the upper management, and for them as well as for the employees. Also establish an ethic code, which is important in all entity, that will establish the values for which the company staff should abide to and comply, and the standards of the organization regarding conduct. And finally, ensure the technical adequacy and develop contingency plans. There's two great aspects, and nowadays there are many companies, or most of them, work with a technological platform, and there are some that depend more or less from technology. So there should be a plan that will ensure continuity in that aspect, and as far as the operational part of the company to continue if any situation comes about in the company through situation or if situations in the operating country. And speaking about the role of the board and the audit committee, there can be others. I think there's a very simple way, and I would like to conclude that the role of the audit committee is to influence importantly in the corporate governance. In other words, that's the line of action of the audit committee, and we know that the audit committee works and has available an important element of the internal audit function where it becomes a branch of the audit committee to comply with all the strategy in any given situation in a company, and it's also related to the contracting external auditors, and it's the communication with external auditors. These are important elements, and the audit committee and as other committees of corporate governance, for instance, the compensation committee, investment committee, or the disclosure committee, depending on the structure. So in some mechanisms, the audit committee, when referring to the control element, is also part of, but not invading the roles of other committees. I think these are important elements to support the corporate governance. And regarding the influence and working through the plan with internal audit and through its bylaws, which will state the working mechanisms of the audit committee in an entity as part of the corporate governance. And referring quickly to the auditor's report, an important aspect I want to highlight is the objectives of the ISP. We know that the report of 2 paragraphs of the past have been changing over time. And as very well explained a colleague from Argentina, I would like to refer to 3 important elements aligned to the ISP has stated. Increase the trust of the users of the audit reports. We know we come from moments of crisis and situations faced by this sector where audit firms have had a relationship with clients where at some points have generated doubts as far as the auditor's conduct. However, today with this new report that seeks to increase trust and provide greater transparency and improve communication with investors and in corporate governance, I think these are important elements that are important elements that add value, especially for the financial statement users. That we now know that these financial statements, even if a company hires us as auditors, we know that these financial statements don't go specifically to the client only, but indirectly these go to the public if it's a regulated entity, or to different instances because of the transactions of the company. The company could be interested in sending this report to a specific client, to a specific provider, or someone in the community where the company has activities, and it's important for them to know. So all these elements are important to show that the auditor's responsibility, although it's with the client, it goes beyond, and we owe ourselves to the public at the end. Another important element about the report is that the corporate governance, as the entity who strives for the company to work on the right path and prevail, should focus the quality of information or these reports in function of a third party, of the public, and seeking the quality of information required for third parties. Although the auditor's report in many cases is something legally mandatory, it shouldn't be seen as mandatory to hire audit, but instead to see the added value of transparency and trust gained from the public. And now the other aspect I want to highlight, if in this slide, and according to the last information on international transparency in Latin America and the Caribbean, there's a high index of corruption, and this is concerning the latest Auditor'S effect involved companies and many governments, and these are situations that nowadays are of concern, and it becomes an inherent risk, very important to the auditor and its scope of action, because this situation must be considered in their professional work for its proper diligence. So independent as a structure, I think the quality control element in a firm should have an important role, but above all, abiding to the ethical principles of that ethics code for the proper work of the auditor. And another important point related to the auditor's report, I just want to say two aspects. What should we communicate? Aspects or significant findings that require immediate action that we identified during the course of our work, and above all, the size or probability of this event materializing. This is related to contingency, and any disclosure we must include in our report. And a final important aspect as an auditor is what knowledge does the administration have of this? Are they clear about the situations, about the findings and the circumstance, or was the management unaware of many aspects? This is something that must concern us as auditors. If the management is not aware of situations happening in the company, or things that are reported by the auditor that the management did not know. In the next slide, this was mentioned. I want to be repetitive, but I want to refer to key aspects of the auditor. I think this is a very important aspect, and I just want to highlight that the auditor uses its professional judgment to determine these key aspects. It gathers evidence and gives a conclusion. However, the answer to these aspects should be part of the institution's controls to cover these key aspects. Very simply said, currently, with a change in the regulation, a company where determining possible loss is a key aspect related to client portfolio. For that, now we have NIFS 9, and the auditor will have to develop all the procedure and judgment to determine if the management has, as part of the controls, a way to determine anticipated loss, and with the methodology included in the standard, including variables that must be documented, and this is for the effect of providing proper conclusions in key aspects. And almost to finish my intervention, I just want to mention some aspects. For instance, Lehman Brothers, and this is related to important debt. Here, the assessment of the accounting was very important or on the investment portfolio, and also WorldCom related to business continuity, and General Motors. And this illustrates that nowadays, with these new reports, I think this has improved the information and the use by the final users. Although I've heard in forums that these key aspects was being done because the auditor has always determined which are the most important areas or risk areas to focus its work. However, today there's been a formality. Now there's a structure of how the auditor's reports must be disclosed for the user to see the key aspects of the audit in whatever is regarded to the auditor's report. And I have a minute left. I don't want to extend myself because all my colleagues have been abiding to time. I want to speak about the public sector entities, or talking about public entities. A first point is that all government is public and is owed to the citizens. As far as entities, or public entities, they should have a management structure, planning activity structure, risk management, and controls, values, and ethics code, audit, and performance audits. All these aspects in public entities are important to be carried out for a good management of any given institution. And it has to the vulnerability aspects related to leadership and the commitment of government organs, and with internal and external communication, accountability, and transparency. All these elements are important, but they'll exist as long as the political will of the governor has it as a goal and performance. And as we all know, in greater or lesser degree, the institutionality in the countries, and this depends on political will of the governors. And we could see how in the private sector there is companies with proper corporate governance. In the government, we can also find with a lesser degree, but we can find some governments, intents to improve. So there are many circumstances surrounding the public sector relate to many aspects, and it's not the object here, but just take into account that with good leadership and governance, it's important for an entity to walk a proper path and give fruits to the citizens according to the type of entity that that is managed. And as far as reports, we know there's an institution called the General Comptroller, or Accounts Tribunal in some countries, that somehow perform oversight or hire external auditors for the oversight or reports that will give transparency to the citizens or the public sector. And these reports will depend on this structure, but we cannot leave out the very important aspect of key aspects and the structure of internal controls, and compliance is also a very important topic. So these are the aspects I deemed important to discuss of the relationship between the audit committee and corporate governance. Thank you very much. Thank you for this presentation. We had little quick process. I think we did very good as far as time. Thank you very much. Also, the private sector highlighted the experience. We'll leave the audit report very transparent, informing everyone very well about the findings, critical findings, and increased communication, and all the important aspects of a very strong governance that can guide the control structure. Financial reports which increase the trust in financial statements and support a capital investment, which is very important for the development of the countries of our region. Trust. It's more important than a positive or negative result. We must have trust. The administration must be prepared in financial matters and show these reports and be responsible for the governance structure. This is responsibility of the company's administration, not of the auditor. The auditor is responsible for certifying the accounts in a proper report. And the audit committees that are different in every country, but have the very important role of supervising the process of preparing financial statements, which is basic to build trust. The members of the audit committee, and according to some companies, the committees should have, there should be boards that are effective, with some experts in accounting that know how to assess the auditor's work, that have to pay for this work, challenge the auditor as far as the professional independence, which is the basis for the auditor's work. Otherwise, the auditor cannot have conflicts of interest in its judgments and in its service provision. It's important to have proper policies to approve services that could somehow affect the work of the auditor. Banned services cannot be allowed because these would require the board's approval. We must have approval of allowed services and have a group of regulators who are experts, who know the work, how to ledgers, and the auditor's work, with competent resources, who can assess and have authorities to penalize those who deviate from their primary function, which is providing real information. So the auditor should audit, and the company has a responsibility to carry out true reports. Everyone has a very important role in this process. The management, the auditor, the audit committees, the boards of directors, depending on the governance structure, the regulators must be also supervised. Why not? And an investment structure with active investors who know the process, who know how to get the best services and the best communication. This ecosystem will allow creating proper capital and the development of enterprise. For regulated enterprise, for the regulated enterprise and non-regulated, and which will of these companies that are constantly supervised. We have a very important role, each one in their role as a governance, as auditors, as board of the directors, and as regulators, and provide the information to the public in a timely and proper way, in a structure, in a proper preparation. We have a few minutes left, but I have a couple of questions for the panel members, and I would also like to invite the public. With these cards, you can write any questions. We have 5 minutes for questions. So, if you like, the organizers can pass around these cards, and please use the microphone for any question. I don't know if we'll answer all the questions, but you can go ahead and post any questions. So I invite everyone to ask. If I'm allowed, I have a question for all of you. How is the process of communication, the key matters for the corporate governance and audit committees? Does it improve the communication? Does it make the process more complex or more expensive? Is it positive? Or is it not positive? this process, does it improve the competitiveness between peers, or is there problems with competitiveness? Uh, does communication with the board improve? What is the experience, and what are your views in regarding the importance and the positive or negative effect of the key outlet matters?
Gracias. Bueno, voy a referirme básicamente a la
I'll refer basically to the communication with the audit committee. I believe that key matters are very important. In communication, there is, if there's a fluid communication between the auditor, the independent auditor, and the audit committee, I think it allows to have a clear view of these key outlet matters and how the company manages these and what outcomes are given by the auditor. Remember that members of the board of directors are also, some of these members are part of the audit committee and are complemented in some cases by external individuals to have a balance in that committee, to have experts in international standards, accounting aspects, or other matters. So these members of the committee or the audit committee transfers information to the board of directors or the governance to maintain informed. So I think this facilitates, and this information, this communication is beneficial, for it allows to have overtime to inform how these aspects are understood. Remember that in many companies nowadays, the audit activity is not done at the end, but it's done quarterly or every 6 months. And this allows to have more expeditious communication with the board or corporate governance. And the important thing is any issue that comes about from the auditor's work, there could be important aspects that were detected and are communicated, even if there's no time to meet the audit committee to present these matters. But there can be a communication established with a special meeting with the committee to cover these aspects. For me, this is very important. I think it's a big challenge for companies to know that key outlet matters that existed are the ones that now have to be disclosed by the auditor. The fact that these are now disclosed implies for the company managers a challenge in transparency, not because they didn't have it, but that problem was in the papers of the auditor, and now they must be disclosed. Therefore, initially, I see this as an obstacle and a challenge that must determine to end up being positive based on the understanding of the companies that it's a standard and it has to be complied with, and how the auditor manages this dialogue with the corporate governance of the entities and to agree and thus achieve the objectives, as Cornelia said, which is proposed by this new audit committee, which is to provide greater transparency and make the auditor's work of better quality, and thus comply with the key objective of this process, which is to better inform and more timely inform with greater detail, which didn't exist in the past.
I mean, government doesn't really have listed companies, so the whole issue of the key audit matters would not necessarily arise. However, there is very active communication between the auditor and the audit committees on a whole range of matters. One of the areas that I'm finding interesting has to do with reporting on deficiencies to those charged with governance. Sometimes the deficiencies actually occur at the, as I said earlier, at the board level actually. Um, how does the auditor feel about reporting, well, in this case, it would be to Parliament, about deficiencies in governance by the audit committees or the boards or management? And then another interesting area has to do with the role of the auditor, the public sector auditor, as it relates to entities who refuse to submit timely submission of their financial statements. The private sector auditor, the public sector auditor takes on a slightly different role than a private auditor. He's charged in terms of carrying out the audit of the enterprises. If they don't produce financial statements, then what does the auditor do? Does the auditor carry out an evaluation as to why these financial statements are not being produced and make that report to those who are in charge of governance, which includes the boards and Parliament and the public? That is something that I've been sort of giving some attention to within recent days, actually.
All the panel members, I think we're able to convey a proper message. I wonder if there's any question from the public. Is there questions? If I correctly understood, Mariana, a UI partner to pose such difficult question. The comment is related to accession or the different responsibilities of the agents or the actors who audit, supervise reporting functions. And if you ask if, in this context, what should be the role of the auditor in aspects related to of insurance and non-insurance or services related. I don't know if I correctly understood this question. I don't know if this is related to the auditor's independence or not. Who posed this question? Who made the question? Can you tell me who made the question? Can you expand on this question so we can answer or not answer your question or answer your question? It's the following. In this whole context of insurance standards, it refers to all the financial statements of different aspects from financial, different scopes. But all this has to be put in context of the complete role. You have to understand the information chain. So there are managers, there's also audit committees, there's a board of directors that has different responsibilities, but there are other agents, for instance, supervision authorities. So the supervisors like to transfer to the accountants certain functions they cannot develop. So my question is, in those matters, because there are matters that are clearly assurance, financial audit, internal controls, compliance, those are assurance. But there are other topics that are not. And if it's not assurance, so it's not giving a positive or negative, but because of a direct report. How should that be done to prevent those independence conflicts that could arise? Who would like to respond? If I may, I should have combined that question or explained that question previously. I take that the question is related to things that frequently we see are part of the auditor's report, which not necessarily respond to a specific topic of the auditor. We also have that in my country. We must inform, as part of the auditor's report, some things related to debts companies have with the collection agencies or the anti-money laundering controls. And we are forced to do these things because of different regulations, and it's not specific of our knowledge. However, we have been developing professional solutions that have helped us find ways to comply with this mission and to do this according to what is required. But it would definitely be good if these responsibilities that I insist go beyond the limit of the classic audit work. It would be great if these disappeared, or to have less influence in the auditor's work. But for now, we have no other choice than to continue including these. These responsibilities are related to the auditor's role, but these would require a separate report. For instance, in Brazil, we must include these things not in the auditor's report with specific public communications, but it varies from one country to the other. We can expand on that if you're interested. I think we're gonna entertain the last question and then we have a short 1 minute closing, and we close the activity. So one question. The question, I was listening to that question, and it's not too much, the independence is not important, but I think it's more focused on ethics. Ethics, I believe we can see as far as regulating entities, as far as institutions that regulate banking or insurance or securities market, that the authorities, and as you said, must be experts or have the capacity, technical capacity, not necessarily be good people, because the idea is not to take a good person. Everyone agrees with that, that's fine, but they must be experts with independency. I think that's where it's going, and we could see. And this is from the regulators. But if we see it from the auditors' part, we're auditors, but you realize that entities that are regulating, even the public accountants, they issue laws, are as weak to be able to punish in ethic matters. And yesterday I received in my WhatsApp sanction ETT in Spain, and it's regarding ethics, and it's related to doing non-allowed work where you clearly see there's not a lack of independence but lack of ethics. So here it's very important. It should be critical, and we see in our countries when someone comes to manage an entity that authorizes accountants or that issues laws which is not related to an audit firm, a big firm that has capacity, but it is independent. It issues very important laws, and it makes everyone you have to comply with very important governance matters. I think that's where the challenge is. So the question is what to do in this case. And we even spoke a lot about corporate governance, but you realize that at the end, the audit committees are losing authority. The board of director comes, the audit committee approves, and at the end, the board of directors disapproves because of business reasons, and this is related to the corruption cases. So what to do with these challenges? Because if we talk about transparency, we reach those levels and not just pure independency, but going beyond ethics. And here you can see that EWC is being punished, but where's the committee that approved that? They should be punished because the committee lacked ethics in allowing that. So these challenges, I think, are important to go beyond, because it's not enough for you to have a corporate governance structure with good people, but are not empowered, don't have the necessary authority to be ethical in the moment required. Thank you. Thank you for this comment, and I thank you for your comments. And we talk about independence, we're talking about ethics. So the person should have authority and to practice authority, and everyone's co-responsible for this. Ethics is the foundation for everything. So for everyone's benefit, we have to close now. I thank you for all your comments, and we're all at your disposal for any question. Thank you for your support. Many colleagues, professionals, many people here that I know, and I thank World Bank's invitation, KPMG, who invited us, and many professionals from Wyatt and here. Thank you very much.